the ancient woodlands of Yorkshire, where folklore and shadow intertwine beneath the canopy, a morning walk becomes a descent into darkness. When Victoria Pemberton falls into an abandoned mineshaft, she discovers that some rescues come with unexpected bargains. This is Victorian Cthulhu. Episode 3, Hob and Hobbled. The September morning carried the first hint of autumn's approach as Victoria Pemberton made her way along the woodland path behind the servants' cottages. Golden light filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns across the well-worn track that wound between ancient oaks and silver birch. Mr. Rat trotted beside her with evident reluctance, his lead taut as he cast longing glances at the undergrowth beyond his reach. "Don't look at me like that," Victoria said, adjusting her grip on the leather strap. "You know perfectly well why you're confined to this arrangement. Uncle Nate never has to chase you halfway across Yorkshire when you decide to pursue some fascinating scent." The small terrier's expression suggested wounded dignity, his tail wagging with restrained enthusiasm as various woodland creatures rustled tantalizingly out of bounds. "We're stuck with each other, I'm afraid," she continued, stepping carefully around a fallen branch. "At least until you learn some proper discipline." The morning air carried the rich scents of damp earth and dying leaves, punctuated by the distant sound of sheep calling from Harper's pastures. Victoria breathed deeply, savouring the rural tranquillity. After months of London's sooty atmosphere, the Yorkshire countryside felt like a different world entirely. She was contemplating whether to extend their walk toward the village when an unexpected sound brought her to an abrupt halt. Somewhere ahead, carried on the still air, came what sounded distinctly like crying, not the bleating of animals or the call of birds, but something that suggested genuine distress. A child, perhaps, lost in the woods. Victoria tilted her head, listening intently. The sound came again, plaintive and urgent, emanating from somewhere deeper in the forest. Mr. Rat had heard it too, his ears pricked forward with interest, though he showed none of the protective alertness that typically accompanied human presence. "Could be a wild creature," she murmured, though her instincts were already stirring. Whatever was making that sound, it required investigation. After several minutes of careful navigation, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by an unexpected sight. A low stone wall, no higher than Victoria's waist, surrounded what appeared to be an excavation. A weathered wooden sign, its paint faded but still legible, warned, "Abandoned mine workings, extreme danger." Victoria approached cautiously, peering over the wall's rough-hewn stones. Beyond lay a circular opening perhaps 6 feet across, its depths disappearing into absolute darkness. An iron grille that should have covered the aperture completely had been pushed to one side, leaving half the opening exposed to the sky. The crying sound was definitely coming from below. "Hello?" Victoria called, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Is someone down there? Are you hurt?" Mr. Rat positioned himself beside her, tail wagging as he peered into the hole with canine curiosity. The crying had stopped at the sound of her voice, replaced by an expectant silence that seemed somehow more unsettling. Victoria's practical nature warred briefly with caution, but her inherent determination won decisively. Someone, likely a child, was trapped in that abandoned mine, and regardless of posted warnings, she could hardly walk away without offering assistance. Hitching up her skirts slightly, she climbed over the stone wall, wincing as dirt and moss stained her dress. "I'm coming to help," she called, kneeling at the edge of the opening. "Don't be frightened." She leaned forward, straining to hear any response from the depths below, when suddenly, without warning, she felt 2 distinct hands press firmly against her shoulders. The push was unmistakably deliberate, sending her tumbling forward into the yawning darkness. Her startled cry echoed off stone walls as she plummeted through empty air, Mr. Rat's frantic barking growing fainter above her. The sensation of falling seemed to last forever, though it could have been mere seconds before she struck the bottom with tremendous force. Icy water closed over her head, shocking her system and filling her mouth with the metallic taste of underground streams. She flailed desperately. her heavy skirts tangling around her legs as she fought to reach the surface. When her head finally broke through, gasping and sputtering, she found herself standing in water that reached nearly to her shoulders. Fighting down rising panic, Victoria forced herself to think rationally. The water was perhaps 4 feet deep, enough to break her fall and save her life, but the landing had clearly injured her ankle severely. Every movement sent sharp agony shooting up her leg. Reaching out desperately in the pitch darkness, her numb fingers found the rough edge of a stone ledge barely inches above the waterline. With considerable effort, and no small amount of pain, she managed to haul herself from the freezing water onto the mercifully dry surface. She lay there for several minutes, shivering violently as water dripped from her sodden clothing. The cold was already seeping into her bones, and she knew that hypothermia would become a serious concern if rescue didn't come soon. Her ankle throbbed with each heartbeat, and she suspected it was more than merely twisted. Working by touch alone, she wrung what moisture she could from her skirts and jacket, though the heavy fabrics retained most of their unwelcome burden. The darkness was so complete that she couldn't see her own hands, let alone determine the size or shape of her underground prison. "At least I'm alive," she whispered, her voice sounding small and fragile in the confined space. Nathaniel Milbane set down his teacup and glanced toward the window of his cottage, noting with satisfaction that the morning had remained fine. Victoria had chosen a good day to take on the duty of exercising their small dog. A scratching at his door interrupted these pleasant reflections. Opening it revealed the very animal in his thoughts standing on the threshold, his lead trailing behind him, and his expression distinctly sheepish. "Where's Miss Pemberton?" Nathaniel asked, immediately concerned. Mr. Rat was never separated from his temporary mistress during their walks. A quick inquiry next door confirmed Isabel's ignorance of Victoria's whereabouts. "Perhaps she dropped his lead and is still searching for him," Isabel suggested. "You know how determined she can be about such things." Nathaniel nodded, though something about the dog's behaviour struck him as unusual. Still, Victoria was remarkably capable of looking after herself, and the Yorkshire countryside, while remote, was hardly dangerous. "She'll return when she's ready," he agreed, though he made a mental note to give the matter more serious attention if she hadn't appeared within the hour. Victoria had been sitting in the darkness for what felt like an eternity when she realized the crying sound had stopped entirely. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat and the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely. "Is anyone there? I heard crying. Are you hurt?" Silence greeted her inquiry, stretching out until she began to wonder if her ears had deceived her entirely. Then, just as she was about to conserve her energy and wait quietly for rescue, a voice spoke from the darkness. "I'm sorry about your ankle." Victoria started violently, nearly losing her precarious position on the ledge. The voice was definitely male, though oddly pitched, neither young nor old, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Most unsettling of all, it seemed to come from no particular direction. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "Where are you?" "I'm sorry you hurt your ankle," the voice repeated, carrying a note of genuine regret. "I didn't mean for that to happen. That was careless of me." "Who are you?" Victoria struggled to peer into the darkness, but could discern nothing beyond the tiny circle illuminated by the distant opening above. "Can you help me get out of here?" "I cannot help you climb," the voice replied, and there was something almost whimsical in its tone. "But I can help you in other ways. Reach to your left. Carefully, mind the wet stones." Despite every instinct warning her against trusting a disembodied voice in an abandoned mine, Victoria's practical nature asserted itself. She was trapped regardless, and if this mysterious person could offer assistance, she was hardly in a position to refuse. Her searching fingers found a small, smooth cylinder, unmistakably a candle. "Keep feeling," the voice encouraged. "There should be something else." Her hand encountered a small wooden box, and when she opened it, the distinctive sulphur scent of matches reached her nostrils. "A large church candle," she murmured, striking a match with trembling fingers. "How did you?" The candle caught immediately, flaring to life with warm, steady light that pushed back the oppressive darkness. But even as relief flooded through her at being able to see her immediate surroundings, Victoria realized something was very strange. The heat radiating from the flame was far too intense for any ordinary candle. It warmed her chilled skin as effectively as a blazing hearth. "How is that possible?" she breathed, staring at the seemingly normal candle in wonder. "It's the least I can do," the voice replied, and now she could detect a note of something almost playful in its tone, "after bringing you all the way down here." "If you can do this with a candle," she said carefully, her voice carrying across the unseen expanse of the underground chamber, "surely you can help me get out of here." "I will help you," the voice replied, and she noticed how it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But before that, I wish to make you an offer." Victoria waited, her journalistic training having taught her the value of patient silence when sources were preparing to reveal important information. The candle's light revealed her immediate surroundings: rough stone walls carved from living rock, evidence of old mining operations, but the voice's owner remained completely invisible. "The land is out of balance," the voice continued, carrying a tone of genuine concern mixed with something almost musical. "And I know you and your friends are trying to fix it. I can give you assistance." Victoria's mind worked quickly through the implications. "Are you talking about the coven?" "I am." The voice carried a note of satisfaction, as though pleased by her swift comprehension. "They hold a power far beyond what they should possess. They are draining the land, and we are suffering because of it." "We?" Victoria adjusted her position, wincing as her injured ankle protested. "Who are you? Who are we?" "Your people have many names for us," the voice replied, and now she could detect something almost ancient in its cadence. "Brownies, goblins, pixies. Around here, the local folk call us hobs." Victoria absorbed this revelation with characteristic directness. "Like a fairy?" The pause that followed felt distinctly offended. "Definitely not like a fairy," the voice said firmly, carrying unmistakable indignation. Despite her circumstances, Victoria found herself suppressing a smile. "My apologies. So what should I call you? What should I call you personally?" "I cannot say my name," the voice replied, its tone growing more serious. "It's against the rules. Names have power, and power shared carelessly becomes power lost." "Very well. Then I shall call you Hob, if that suits you." "It will suffice." The voice seemed to approve. "Now, about my offer, I can perform a small enchantment, nothing grand, you understand, but effective nonetheless. This magic will reveal the source of the coven's power, show you what they possess that grants them such unnatural abilities. But to accomplish this, I require specific materials." Victoria considered this proposition carefully. "What sort of materials?" "4 particular items, each with its own significance. If you will be my eyes and hands, help me gather what I need, then I will help you solve the mystery of where the coven derives its strength." "That seems a fair bargain," Victoria said. "But why can't you collect these things yourself?" Hob grew quieter, tinged with what sounded like weariness. "My people, we have limitations. We cannot easily interact with your world without invitation, without trust freely given. That is why I need someone like you." Victoria's ankle throbbed as she shifted position on the stone ledge, reminding her forcefully of her precarious situation. Even if this creature, this Hob, had been responsible for her fall, he was now offering assistance that could prove invaluable to their mission. "I accept your offer," she said firmly. "What must I do?" Hob's tone brightened immediately, carrying a note of genuine pleasure. "Marvelous! But first, there are conditions. The most important being that you must promise to not tell a soul about me. When we return to the surface, you must keep my presence absolutely secret at all times. This is not negotiable." "You have my word," Victoria replied without hesitation. "Excellent! Now, don't be startled by what happens next." Suddenly, The voice was no longer distant, but directly behind her head, so close that she could feel warm breath against her ear. Victoria jumped, nearly dropping the candle in surprise. "Don't worry," the voice said, now clearly positioned just behind her left shoulder. "I'm simply sitting on your back. No one can see me, but I will travel with you. We need to have haste. Your friends are above, and they are looking for you. Quickly, blow out the candle." Victoria lifted the church candle to her mouth and blew gently on the flame. As the light extinguished, plunging her back into what should have been absolute darkness, she felt the world shift around her in a strange, dizzying way. When her vision adjusted, she gasped in amazement. The distant pinpoint of light that had marked the mine's entrance was now merely a few feet above her head. Somehow, impossibly, she was sitting on a narrow ledge just below the surface opening, no longer trapped 40 feet underground. "How did you?" she began. "Call them," Hob interrupted, his voice carrying new urgency. "They're very close." Victoria could hear voices calling her name, growing louder as their owners approached the clearing. With careful movements that favoured her healthy ankle, she manoeuvred herself into position below the opening. "Uncle Nate, Mr. Chester?" she called upward, relief flooding her voice. "I'm here." Victoria sat in the cottage's modest sitting room, still grasping the large white candle she had found in the mine. Her injured ankle was elevated on a wooden stool while Isabel knelt beside her, carefully examining the swelling with gentle, practiced hands. The morning's adventure had left Victoria's clothing damp and stained, though she had managed to wring most of the water from her skirts during the rescue operation. "I believe it's merely twisted," Isabel said, her soft voice carrying a note of professional assessment. "The bones feel properly aligned, though the bruising will likely worsen before it improves." Will stood at the window with his back pointedly turned toward the ladies, his shoulders tense with residual worry. "I still can't fathom how serious that could have been," he said, his voice carrying an edge of distress. "You could have been killed, Miss Pemberton." "Mr. Chester," Victoria replied bluntly, "please don't stand with your back to me. I'm quite certain your soul won't end up in perdition, simply because you've glimpsed my bare foot." Will turned reluctantly, keeping his gaze fixed studiously towards the hearth rather than risk impropriety. "I am just very worried about you." A tiny voice whispered directly into Victoria's ear, so quietly that only she could hear. "I believe this gentleman is quite fond of you, Miss Victoria." "Please be quiet," Victoria snapped, her tone carrying the sharp authority of someone addressing an impertinent child. Will's expression registered confusion and mild hurt. "I beg your pardon?" Victoria caught herself immediately, realizing her error. No, I don't mean you should be quiet. I merely meant that I'm perfectly fine, and we needn't worry ourselves too much about what might have happened." Isabel looked up from her examination of the ankle, her perceptive eyes studying Victoria's face with growing curiosity. "You seem rather distracted, Victoria. Are you certain you weren't injured more seriously? Perhaps a blow to the head?" "I am fine," Victoria replied quickly. "I'm simply tired and somewhat shaken by the experience." "We should bandage this ankle properly," Isabel said, rising gracefully. "The support will help with the swelling." "And given your current restricted mobility," Nathaniel added, "please feel free to borrow this." He extended his ebony walking cane with its silver head, a gesture of practical courtesy. "I only use it for show anyway. I rather enjoy waving the thing about during particularly dramatic moments." Victoria accepted the cane with gratitude, testing its weight and finding it perfectly suited to her height. "Thank you, Uncle Nate. Most considerate." "Now then," she continued, struggling to her feet with the cane's assistance, "if you gentlemen wouldn't mind, I really must get myself properly cleaned up and changed. This damp clothing is becoming rather uncomfortable." Will immediately moved toward the door. "Of course." A soft chuckle in Victoria's ear came with distinctly mischievous overtones. "And I also promise you, Miss Pemberton, that I shall turn my back like a proper English gentleman." Victoria bit back her automatic response, managing this time to maintain her composure until the men had withdrawn and she could attend to her appearance in privacy. 30 minutes later, having changed into dry clothing and arranged her hair properly, Victoria emerged to find Isabel organising medical supplies in the sitting room. "I shall take a short walk," Victoria announced, adjusting her grip on Nathaniel's cane. Isabel looked up with evident concern. "Are you certain that's wise, with your ankle in such condition?" "I won't venture far," Victoria promised, making her way toward the door with careful steps. "I'll simply walk to the village on the main road, nothing adventurous, I assure you. The cane will provide adequate support." Once Victoria had moved beyond earshot of the cottages, she spoke quietly toward her invisible passenger. "So what exactly do we need to do? Where must we go?" "Come then," Hob replied, his voice carrying renewed enthusiasm. "We must first visit my house. There's something there we require before we can begin collecting the materials. Follow the path back into the woodland. I'll guide you." Victoria obeyed, though the uneven ground made walking with her injured ankle challenging even with the cane's assistance. "There," Hob said as they approached what appeared to be a large yew tree growing in isolation. "My house." Victoria stared at the ancient tree with confusion. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Walk around it," Hob instructed, "but mind you, anti-clockwise, and you must complete 3 full circuits." "Anti-clockwise 3 times?" Victoria repeated, feeling rather foolish. "Are you quite certain?" "There are rules, Miss Victoria. If you wish my assistance, you must follow the proper procedures." Victoria began her peculiar circumnavigation, using the cane to maintain balance on the uneven ground. She completed the first circuit, then the second circuit, with no obvious transformation. But as she finished the third and final revolution, she gasped in surprise. Where previously there had been only empty ground within the tree's natural boundaries, she now saw a perfect ring of mushrooms sprouting from the earth. Beside it was what appeared to be a miniature dwelling constructed entirely from woven sticks and moss, no larger than a child's playhouse. "Oh my!" Victoria breathed, staring at the fairy ring. "Look at those mushrooms!" The mushrooms were unlike any she had seen before, their caps a sickly brownish colour, with twisted, unnatural shapes that made her skin crawl. They appeared diseased or corrupted, their surfaces bearing dark patches that suggested rot or decay. "Don't concern yourself with those," Hob said dismissively. "What we need is inside the house." Victoria approached the tiny structure, marvelling at its intricate construction. Thin branches had been woven together with remarkable skill, creating walls barely 3 feet high. A miniature door stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the dwelling's interior. Crouching carefully to avoid putting weight on her ankle, Victoria peered into the diminutive space. She could make out tiny furniture, a bed constructed from twigs and moss, a shelf carved from a single piece of wood, even what appeared to be a miniature cupboard. "Take the scroll from the shelf," Hob instructed, "then throw it back over your shoulder, and I shall catch it." Victoria located the small rolled parchment and followed Hob's instructions, tossing it backward into empty air. She heard no sound of it being caught, but Hob's voice immediately carried satisfaction. "Excellent, I have it." There was a pause, as though he were examining the document. "Yes, this is the list of things we need to collect. Are you prepared to begin, Miss Victoria?" Victoria straightened, testing her weight on the walking cane. "I shall do my best." Victoria made her way down the familiar path toward Baildon village, Nathaniel's walking cane providing essential support on the uneven ground. Hob's demeanour had transformed completely since their serious underground negotiations. Where he had been grave and urgent in the mine shaft, he now chatted with apparent delight at their shared enterprise. "There's Mr. Oakes," Hob remarked as they passed a bearded man carrying planks of timber. "Works at the lumber yard. Generally a decent fellow, though there was that incident with the sixpence from the church collection plate." His voice carried the satisfaction of someone sharing particularly choice information. "And over there, Mrs. Green, the baker's wife. She often finds herself in rather compromising situations with one of the farmers from the neighbouring village." Victoria stopped short, appalled. "Really, Hob? I hardly think it honourable to be sharing what amounts to common gossip about every person we encounter." Oh? Hobbs' tone turned slyly amused. I rather thought a journalist might be interested in all the little secrets behind the curtains, all the hidden truths beneath the surface. Victoria walked several steps in pointed silence, her moral sensibilities warring with her professional curiosity. Finally, in a voice attempting disapproval but betraying unmistakable interest, she said, "Very well, you may continue." Hob chuckled. "Let us focus on our task. First we need cheese from the milk of a goat. The grocer's shop will sell it." Victoria entered the modest establishment, its shelves lined with goods imported from Leeds and London. Mr. Barker looked up from his ledgers with evident pleasure. "Miss Pemberton, I do hope you're enjoying your stay in our little village." "Very much, thank you. I was wondering. I've heard you stock goat's cheese, but I don't see any displayed." "Indeed we do. I keep the cheeses in the cellar where it's cooler. Give me a moment to fetch you a piece." As Barker disappeared through the back door, Hobbs' voice carried a distinctly mischievous note. "Oh, there's one small detail I forgot to mention. The goat's cheese must be stolen, not purchased." Victoria nearly dropped her cane. "What do you mean, stolen? I'm certainly not going to steal from that nice man." "I don't make the rules," Hob replied with obvious amusement. "How am I supposed to steal it anyway?" Victoria hissed. "Well, why don't you simply grab it and run?" "Run? I can barely walk at the moment." "Ah, good point. I suppose my suggestions are rather terrible. I'll keep quiet. You work out how to collect our stolen goat's cheese." "This is utterly ridiculous," Victoria muttered. "I'm sorry," Barker said, returning with a cloth-wrapped package. "I didn't catch what you said." No, I was just clearing my throat." Victoria's mind raced desperately. "Here's the cheese. Would you care to taste it before purchasing?" "That would be lovely." Victoria did her best to make her smile look genuine. Barker cut a small sample with his cheese knife. Victoria tasted it, finding it surprisingly sharp and pleasant. "It's very nice indeed." Barker looked at her expectantly as she scrambled with her thoughts. "Actually, you mentioned having other types of cheese. Could I perhaps sample some different varieties?" "Certainly. We have several fine English varieties and an excellent sheep's cheese. Let me bring you a proper selection." The moment Barker disappeared again, Victoria stared at the block of cheese in panic. Quickly, she picked up the knife, sliced off a piece, wrapped it hastily in her handkerchief, and tucked it into her leather handbag. As swiftly as she could manage, she fled from the store. Once safely outside, Victoria leaned heavily on her cane. "That was disappointingly easy," Hob observed, "though I suppose a small piece will have to suffice." His light tone drew a scowl from Victoria, but he continued on oblivious. "Next item, dung from a cloven-hooved animal." "Do you mean something like a sheep?" "Precisely. The Harper farm is quite nearby." They made their way to the familiar farmyard, where the blackened remains of the burned barn were already being cleared away. Seth Hobson emerged from the main building, his manner subdued but polite. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What brings you back to our farm?" Victoria panicked. "I came to look at your sheep. I've always found them such beautiful animals." Seth looked puzzled. "I suppose so. Never given it much thought myself. You're welcome to look around. Just don't touch anything." "Which of this muck is actually from sheep?" Victoria whispered as they walked. "I'm a New York City girl. I've never dealt with farm animals." "I suppose the ones nearest the actual sheep," Hob replied unhelpfully. Victoria spotted a small walled enclosure with several sheep grazing inside. "How much do we need?" "Just one piece should suffice." Glancing towards Seth, who was half watching while organizing tools, Victoria approached the low, dry stone wall. "I'll just lean over and collect something near the edge." She stretched across the wall, reaching for a suitable sample, when the loose-top stones shifted unexpectedly. With a startled cry, she tumbled over the barrier and landed squarely in the sheep droppings. The sheep turned to stare at her with mild curiosity before resuming their grazing. "Really, Miss Victoria?" Hob said with evident amusement. "You must be more careful about tumbling off things and down holes. You pushed me down the last hole, Victoria snapped, brushing at her soiled dress. Never mind arguing now. You need to get out before the farmer investigates. Victoria quickly grabbed a suitable sample, dropped it into her bag alongside the cheese, and scrambled back over the wall with considerable difficulty. "Everything all right, miss?" Seth called, approaching with concern. "Perfectly fine," Victoria replied with forced cheerfulness, attempting to brush sheep dung from her skirts while maintaining her balance. "Just admiring your lovely animals." She gave him a bright wave and hobbled away as quickly as dignity and her injured ankle would permit, leaving Seth staring after her with complete bewilderment. Victoria paused at the edge of the village, brushing futilely at the sheep dung still clinging to her dress. The indignities of the afternoon were mounting considerably, and her patience was wearing thin. "What's next, Hob?" she asked wearily. "A thorn from a hawthorn tree," came the cheerful reply. "I believe there are some prime specimens in the manor grounds. That would be an ideal place to look." Victoria made her way up the familiar drive, grateful that the manor's grounds would provide a more civilized setting for her collecting activities. She located a magnificent hawthorn tree near the kitchen garden, its branches heavy with sharp thorns. "Shall I simply pick one?" she asked, reaching toward a particularly robust specimen. "Well, actually, it's not quite that simple." Victoria sighed deeply. "Of course it isn't." She waited with growing resignation for whatever additional complication Hob was about to reveal. "It must be a thorn from a hawthorn tree that has drawn the blood of a man." "What do you mean by that?" "You're going to have to stab someone with it, enough to draw blood." Victoria stared at the thorn in her hand. "Can't I simply prick my own finger with it?" "No, it has to be someone else." She selected a particularly sturdy thorn, testing its sharpness carefully. "I think this might be my limit, Hob. I'm not certain I can." "Look, there's the gardener," Hob interrupted with what sounded distinctly like an evil giggle. "Go, stab him." "I cannot stab Clem," Victoria protested, but nevertheless found herself hobbling toward the man who was tending a flower bed near the manor's south wall. "Good afternoon, miss," Clem said, looking up from his weeding with a friendly smile. "How are you finding Yorkshire?" "Oh, very pleasant indeed," Victoria replied, desperately trying to sound natural while Hob whispered encouragements in her ear. "Your gardens are absolutely magnificent. Such lovely blooms still, even with autumn approaching." "Aye, it's been a good year for the plants. Summer's fading, but there's still plenty in their prime at this time of year." Clem gestured proudly at his handiwork. "Go on," Hob whispered insistently. "Stab him now." Victoria felt increasingly flustered as she tried to maintain normal conversation while contemplating the bizarre task before her. Finally, in desperation, she allowed her walking cane to slip from under her arm. "Oh my!" she cried, appearing to stumble as her injured ankle gave way. She fell forward with considerable drama, landing rather unceremoniously on top of poor Clem, just as he was reaching for a particularly stubborn weed. During the tumble, she managed to press the hawthorn thorn firmly into his forearm. "Ow!" Clem yelped, more from surprise than pain. "Miss, are you hurt?" Victoria scrambled to extricate herself from the gardener, making profuse apologies. "I'm terribly sorry, Clem. My ankle gave way completely. I fear I may have injured you in my clumsiness." "Not to worry, miss," Clem said kindly, examining the small puncture wound on his arm. "I get cuts and scratches all day long in this work. It's part of the job, so to speak. Are you quite all right yourself?" Throughout this exchange, Victoria could hear Hobbs' delighted giggling at the success of her improvised solution. "Yes, perfectly fine, thank you," Victoria managed, retrieving her cane and the precious thorn. "Again, my sincere apologies." As she hobbled away from the scene, she muttered under her breath, "One more item, and then we're finished with this nonsense. What's the final requirement?" "Hair from a maiden and a crone," Hob replied with evident satisfaction, one strand plucked from each. Victoria paused, considering this. "Well, I suppose I could use a strand of my own hair for the maiden. That shouldn't prove too difficult." She pulled a single hair from her head, wincing slightly at the sharp tug. "I suppose that would suffice," Hobbs said thoughtfully. "Though tell me, would you truly classify yourself as a maiden?" Victoria stopped short, deeply offended. "What on earth are you trying to imply?" Nothing at all," Hob backpedaled hastily. "I'm certain it will serve our purposes admirably. The only person who would qualify as a crone would be Mrs. Crowther," Victoria said, her tone still frosty from Hobbs' impertinent question. "Yes, I believe she would certainly meet the requirements." As they approached the manor house, Victoria asked, "You seem to know considerable gossip about everyone in the village. Can you tell me anything about Mrs. Crowther?" "Actually, I cannot," Hob admitted with unusual restraint. "She's quite a mysterious character. She hasn't been in the area very long, and I've rarely had opportunity to observe what she gets up to." Victoria entered through the kitchen door, nodding pleasantly to Mrs. Sykes, who was preparing vegetables for dinner. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sykes. Is Mrs. Crowther available? I wanted a brief word with her." "She's in the morning room, miss. Reading, I believe." Victoria made her way to the indicated room, trying to formulate a strategy. "Perhaps I could find her hairbrush and collect a strand that way," she whispered. "No," Bob replied firmly. "It must be freshly plucked from her head." "Of course it must," Victoria sighed. She found Mrs. Crowther seated in a comfortable chair near the window, a leather-bound volume open in her lap. The older woman looked up with polite but somewhat chilly attention. "Miss Pemberton, how are your village investigations progressing?" "Not too badly, thank you," Victoria replied, though something in Mrs. Crowther's manner made her feel distinctly uncomfortable. There was an intensity to the woman's gaze that seemed almost knowing. For a moment, Victoria could have sworn Mrs. Crowther was looking directly at her shoulder, as though she could see something perched there. Victoria shook off the unsettling thought and seized her opportunity. "Oh my!" she exclaimed, leaning forward suddenly. "I believe you have an insect on your shoulder." With swift movements that surprised even herself, Victoria reached out and plucked a single grey hair from Mrs. Crowther's carefully arranged coiffure. Mrs. Crowther's reaction was most peculiar. Rather than expressing annoyance or indignation at the presumptuous behaviour, she merely squinted slightly at Victoria, her head tilted with apparent curiosity, as though trying to solve an interesting puzzle. "Well," Victoria said hurriedly, backing toward the door, "I should let you return to your reading. Good afternoon, Mrs. Crowther." She made her escape as quickly as dignity and her walking cane would permit, leaving Mrs. Crowther staring after her with that same enigmatic expression of thoughtful interest. Victoria made her way carefully down the manor drive, relieved to have completed Hobbs' increasingly bizarre collection requirements. The hawthorn thorn was safely tucked in her handbag alongside the goat's cheese, sheep dung and strands of hair, though she couldn't help but feel somewhat criminal about the day's activities. "Well," she said quietly, "I certainly hope that's the end of it. I'm not sure my conscience could withstand any more morally questionable." She paused, noticing that instead of the light-hearted laughter and chatter that had followed her, Hobbs' voice was now quiet. "Hob, are you quite all right?" "Actually, miss, not feeling quite myself," came the reply, though his tone attempted lightness. "Getting a bit wobbly, if I'm honest." Victoria slowed her pace, concern growing. "What's the matter? You sound different." There was a long pause before Hob answered, and when he did, his voice was noticeably weaker. "I was hoping I'd last till the end, but it seems I've used up the last of myself too quickly." "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "Remember what I told you about being cut off from the land?" Hobbs' words came with obvious effort. "Thought perhaps you understood how bad it really is." Victoria felt a chill of realization. "I assumed you meant you couldn't use your powers properly. Are you saying it's more serious than that?" "The land is our life, Miss Victoria. Without that connection," he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "We need to get you back to your house," Victoria said with sudden urgency. "Immediately." She quickened her pace as much as her injured ankle would permit, using Nathaniel's walking cane to navigate the woodland path with desperate efficiency. Behind her, she could hear Hobbs' breathing becoming increasingly laboured. As they approached the yew tree that concealed his dwelling, Victoria felt a sudden shift in weight. Hobb's presence, which had been a consistent pressure between her shoulder blades, suddenly became unstable. "Hold on," she urged, but it was too late. She felt him slip and fall, landing with a soft thud in the undergrowth behind her. Victoria turned quickly and saw him for the first time. He would have stood less than 2 feet, though perfectly proportioned as a man. His face was deeply lined with age, giving him the appearance of an ancient child, with bright golden eyes that seemed far older than his diminutive frame. He wore a neat brown jacket over small dark trousers, with a dark red cap perched on his greying hair and matching red buttons that caught the fading light. His shoes were surprisingly well polished, and in one tiny hand he clutched a walking stick of his own, no bigger than a wooden spoon. The scroll lay scattered beside him where it had fallen from his other hand. "Oh my," Victoria breathed, carefully gathering both Hob and his possessions. He was surprisingly light, weighing no more than a small cat, though she could feel the rapid beating of his heart. "Just get me home," he whispered, his golden eyes struggling to focus. "Quick as you can." Victoria completed the ritual circumnavigation of the tree and made her way to the tiny dwelling. Crouching with considerable difficulty, she managed to maneuver into the miniature space and place Hob gently on his moss and twig bed. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Just listen," Hob said, his words becoming increasingly faint. "Need to tell you before it's too late." Victoria leaned closer, straining to hear. "The coven, they hold something. An object, an artifact, summons a great beast from beneath the earth." "I've encountered something similar before," Victoria said grimly. "Yes, but they've twisted it all wrong. Instead of calling what it was meant for, they've brought something else entirely. Not a beast from below, but something that corrupts nature itself, the trees, the soil, the living things. Growing stronger it is, unchecked. They ask it for power, and it obliges, and they think they can control it." Hobb's voice grew weaker still. "But they're wrong, so very wrong. Catastrophe for everyone if it keeps growing." Victoria frowned suddenly. "Wait, I thought the items we collected were for a spell to discover this information. Why did we gather all those things if you already knew?" Hob managed a weak chuckle, but was too exhausted to answer. His golden eyes fluttered closed, and his breathing became shallow and irregular. "Hob?" Victoria whispered, but he had lost consciousness entirely. In growing panic, Victoria looked around the tiny dwelling until her eyes fell on the scroll they had been carrying. With trembling hands, she unrolled the parchment and read its contents. Her face went pale. "Oh no," she breathed. "Oh, Hob, why didn't you trust me?" When she finished reading, she spoke again to her small ally. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I need to leave you, but I'll return. Hold on." Victoria extracted herself from the tiny dwelling with painful effort and hobbled toward the servants' cottages as quickly as her injured ankle would permit. Every step sent sharp agony up her leg, but Hob's life might depend on speed. She burst through the cottage door to find Nathaniel, Isabel, and Will gathered around the sitting-room table, apparently discussing the day's events. "Everyone," she said breathlessly, "I need your help, urgently." The three looked up in surprise at her dishevelled appearance and obvious distress. "Victoria," Isabel said, rising immediately, "what's happened?" Victoria quickly outlined the day's extraordinary events, the bargain with Hob, the collection of materials, his sudden collapse, and the truth about the coven's corrupted summoning. She handed the scroll to Isabel with shaking hands. "This spell, it claims to cleanse. Can we cast it? Can we perform this ritual?" Isabel studied the parchment carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. "I'm not entirely certain. This isn't precisely my area of expertise. But the way this is written, it's almost as if it is trying to guide a beginner through. You have to help me," Victoria pleaded. "We need to save him. And if what he says about the coven is true, we need to understand what we're truly facing." Nathaniel set down his teacup with a sharp clink. Of course we'll help. Will was already reaching for his coat. Lead the way. Isabel rolled the scroll carefully. We'll need to move quickly if this creature is as weak as you describe. The four companions made their way through the darkening woodland with urgent steps as evening began to fall. Will carried a small lantern to illuminate the increasingly treacherous path, while Isabel walked with the scroll held close to the light, studying its contents as they moved. "This is most peculiar," she said, frowning at the parchment. "The spell seems remarkably simple, unlike most magical workings I've encountered. There are no special words to recite, no complex ritual gestures to perform." "What does it require?" Nathaniel asked. "It appears to be some form of protection from corruption, or perhaps a severing of it, some sort of cleansing effect." Isabel shook her head in puzzlement. "How it's supposed to function, I cannot fathom. The instructions are almost elementary." As Victoria led them toward the yew tree, she felt a warm surge of gratitude. Despite her warnings about the strange ritual they would need to perform, none of her companions questioned her directions. When she guided them in an anti-clockwise circuit around the ancient tree, once, twice, and then a third time, they followed without hesitation. On the third revolution, the tiny dwelling materialized before them, just as Victoria had described. "Good heavens," Will breathed, staring at the miniature structure. "So we need to perform this enchantment at the point where the corruption was applied," Isabel said, consulting the scroll again. "I believe I know where that is," Victoria replied, leading them toward the ring of mushrooms that sat adjacent to Hobbs' house. The fungi were even more disturbing in the lantern light than they had been during the day. Their caps bore an unnatural brownish-black coloration, twisted into shapes that seemed to writhe even when perfectly still. Dark patches spread across their surfaces like disease, and their very presence seemed to drain warmth from the surrounding air. "It must be here," Victoria said, gesturing to the circle. "According to this," Isabel said, still studying the parchment, "we simply place the required items at the point of corruption and sit." She looked up with obvious uncertainty. "There are no mystic words to chant, no ceremonial actions to perform. We merely need to connect ourselves to nature." "What does that mean?" Will asked. Isabel shrugged helplessly. "I haven't the faintest idea." "We can at least try," Victoria said, quickly removing the collected components from her handbag and arranging them in the center of the mushroom ring, the stolen goat's cheese, the sheep dung, the hawthorn thorn stained with Clem's blood, and the strands of hair from herself and Mrs. Crowther. The four companions positioned themselves evenly around the circle, settling onto the damp earth with varying degrees of comfort. "Perhaps we should close our eyes," Victoria suggested. "Listen to the trees, the sounds of the woodland." They sat in silence, focusing on the natural world around them, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant call of night birds, the gentle creaking of ancient branches. The scents of moss and earth filled the air, and gradually Victoria felt herself beginning to relax despite the circumstances. Then she became aware of something else, a presence that had nothing to do with the peaceful woodland sounds, something cold and watchful. "I think I can see a spirit," Will said suddenly, his voice tight with unease, "in the middle of the circle." Victoria opened her eyes and stared into the ring of mushrooms. At first she saw nothing, but gradually a shimmer began to resolve itself in the space above the collected components. "I think I can see something too," Isabel whispered. "What do you see, Will?" "It's a creature, an animal, like something from a farm, a sheep, or no." Will's voice grew more strained. "It's a goat. Jet black, but with 6 legs and red eyes. It's standing there, watching us." "I think this is the corruption," Victoria said, her heart beginning to pound. "I think we're doing the right thing." As they continued to focus on the apparition, a wind began to rise around them. At first it was merely a gentle breeze, but it quickly strengthened, lifting small debris from the forest floor, twigs, leaves, clods of earth, fragments of bark. These materials swirled through the air and began to attach themselves to the spectral form of the goat. Victoria watched in fascination and growing horror as the natural detritus built upon itself, layer by layer, until the spirit began to take on physical substance. Thin branches became legs, gnarled twigs formed horns, and dead leaves filled in the gaps between. The creature's eyes remained a baleful red, but now they glowed from within a head constructed of rotting bark and moss. The thing that emerged was an abomination of corrupted nature, a goat-like entity perhaps 4 feet in height, but wrong in every conceivable way. Its 6 legs were of varying lengths, causing it to move with a lurching, unnatural gait. Its body was a twisted mass of thorns and decay, held together by some malevolent force that defied the natural order. Where a goat's bleating should have come, only a wet, rattling sound emerged from its throat. Most disturbing of all was the way it moved. Each motion was jerky and deliberate, as though the creature was being controlled by something that had only a vague understanding of how living things were supposed to function. It turned its head toward them with mechanical precision, and those burning red eyes fixed on Victoria with unmistakable malice. "What do we do now?" Will asked, his voice barely steady. "I don't know," Isabel admitted, clutching the scroll against her chest. "My instincts tell me this is what we need to deal with," Nathaniel said, rising slowly to his feet. "Miss Pemberton, if you don't mind, I'll borrow my cane." Victoria handed him the walking stick without question. Nathaniel hefted it like a weapon and stepped forward, swinging it with considerable force at the creature's head. The impact sent a shower of twigs and bark flying, but the creature merely turned toward him with that same jerky, unnatural movement. Its red eyes blazed with vicious anger, and it began to advance with its disturbing, lurching gait. "Help me!" Nathaniel called, striking at the thing again. Victoria, Will, and Isabel scrambled to their feet, each grabbing whatever they could find, branches, stones, anything that might serve as a weapon. The creature turned its attention among them randomly, as though unable to focus on multiple threats at once. Victoria brought a heavy branch down across its back, sending more debris flying. Will struck at its legs with a stone, while Isabel used a fallen branch to keep its snapping jaws at bay. The thing made no sound except for that horrible wet rattling, but its movements became increasingly aggressive as pieces of its form were knocked away. Gradually, the creature began to lose cohesion. Sticks fell away from its frame, and the malevolent force holding it together seemed to weaken. Motivated by concern for Hob lying helpless in his tiny house, Victoria raised a particularly large rock above her head and brought it down with all her strength on the creature's skull. The impact shattered the thing's head completely, and like a child's construction of kindling, the entire form collapsed into a scattered pile of forest debris. The red eyes flickered once and went dark. As the last of the creature crumbled away, Victoria noticed something else. The twisted mushrooms around the circle had begun to change. The sickly brown-black coloration was fading, and for just a moment she could have sworn she saw the faintest hint of blue light emanating from their caps, a gentle glow that suggested cleansing, renewal, and the restoration of natural order. Then the light faded, leaving only ordinary mushrooms in the darkness. "Is it over?" Will asked, breathing heavily. "I believe so," Nathaniel replied, examining the scattered remains of the stick creature with his boot. Victoria looked toward Hobb's tiny dwelling, hoping for some sign that their efforts had succeeded, but the miniature house remained dark and silent. "We should wait," Isabel said softly. "Give the magic time to work." They only had to wait a moment, however, before a figure appeared at the entrance to the tiny house. Hob stood before them, his cheeks now rosy with returned health, a warm grin spreading across his weathered features. His golden eyes sparkled with their former vitality, and he moved with the sprightly energy that had characterized their earlier adventures. "Well, Miss Victoria," he said, almost with a flourish, "it seems you broke your promise about telling nobody of our adventure." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Hob continued with a thoughtful expression. "But I suppose I wasn't entirely honest with you either, so We shall call that an even bargain." "You planned this all along, didn't you?" Victoria said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You planned for me to perform the magic." "Can't remove your own curse, can you? Like I told you at the start, there are rules, and you had to be the one to do it. I just trusted you would find a way." Hobbs' grin widened. "Seems I made a good choice." Victoria considered this for a moment, then frowned. Those things we collected, the cheese and the hair and the hawthorn thorn, were they really what we needed for a spell of cleansing? They seemed rather unusual. Hob laughed, a bright sound like wind chimes. "Well spotted. To be honest, I could have asked you to collect anything at all, maybe an overweight mouse or a feather from a peacock." "It didn't really matter." "Then what did matter?" Will asked. "The belief you had when you sat around that circle, that you could reach through the corruption and set things right. I know you humans like to think objects contain magical powers, so I just went along with it." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "So stealing the cheese and stabbing poor Clem, I didn't need to do any of that?" Hobbs' laugh grew even brighter. "Well, no, but that was rather funny, don't you think?" Victoria found herself too relieved and too weary from her injured ankle to do anything but laugh. The absurdity of the entire day's events suddenly struck her as remarkably amusing. Nathaniel stepped forward, taking the revelation in his stride. "Hob, you mentioned to Miss Pemberton that the coven possesses an artifact. Can you tell us more about it?" Hob gave him a respectful nod. "They call it the Veil of Stars, a piece of silk, the finest you'd ever see to look at. Wrap it around yourself, and you can take the shape of anyone you imagine, any form you desire. But its true purpose was to summon a great beast from beneath the earth." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "I thought as much. That makes considerable sense. Are you saying they successfully called forth the beast this artifact was designed to summon?" "No," Hob replied. "As I told Miss Victoria, they summoned something different entirely. How they managed to change the summoning, I don't know. But somebody in that group knows what they're doing, because altering an artifact's purpose would require incredible knowledge." "Why did they need to drive you away?" Isabel asked. "Because they recognized that nature would fight back against their strange beast. So they had to push me and my kind away from the situation, cut us off from our strength." Hobbs' expression grew more serious. "But they have made an enemy of my people. They will come to regret it." "What happens now?" Victoria asked eventually. "Well, I trust you'll find yourselves on the right path to save your land," Hob replied. "Will you be able to help us?" "I'll help, but it'll be in ways you might not notice. I'll be around, gaining my strength back. I have a score to settle, and my people always keep their bargains, even the ones we make for ourselves." Victoria understood that this was as much of a commitment as she was likely to receive. She rose carefully, keeping the weight from her injured ankle. "Thank you, Hob, for everything." "Thank you, Miss Victoria. You've given me back my life." The group made their way slowly from the yew tree back toward the servants' cottages, walking carefully in the twilight with Will's lantern to guide them. "I rather suspect," Isabel said thoughtfully, "that if we were to try retracing our steps to find that place again, we should discover nothing there." Victoria nodded. "I thought the same myself." "What an adventure you've had today, Miss Pemberton," Will observed, "though I confess I'm still struggling to comprehend it all." "Yes, but think of what we've learned," Victoria replied. "We've made some significant steps forward in understanding what we're facing." "We have indeed," Nathaniel agreed. "Your misadventures have helped us more than anything we've accomplished so far. We now have a genuine chance to get ahead of this situation." Victoria considered this as they approached the warm lights of the cottages. "That may well be true," she said finally, "but I intend to spend at least a day taking the weight off my feet. After all the hobbling about I've done today, I believe I've earned a proper rest." As they reached the cottage door, Victoria realized that despite the pain in her ankle and the bizarre nature of the day's events, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had gained a supernatural ally, learned crucial information about their enemies, and proven that the cosmic forces arrayed against them were not invincible. For the first time since arriving in Yorkshire and learning of the coven, She felt genuinely hopeful about their chances of success. As the corrupted fairy ring is cleansed and the woodland spirits stir once more, our investigators have gained an unlikely ally in their fight against the coven's growing power. Yet with each revelation comes deeper mystery. The Veil of Stars grants terrible transformations, an ancient evil corrupts the very land itself, and somewhere in the shadows, the witches continue their dark work. What other horrors have they unleashed upon Yorkshire? And can our heroes trust the folklore creatures who emerge from myth to aid them? If you enjoyed this tale of supernatural alliance, please give it a like. Likes, subscribes, and comments help the channel grow and guide other seekers of dark mystery through the mist to find us. Until next time, beware what bargains you make, for the price may be more than you know.